much fanfare the appointment of its leadership 3 years ago, the National Prosecuting Authority is yet to produce one state capture-related conviction. Instead, a series by Daily Maverick reveals the NPA is riddled with a series of handicaps that simply render it ineffective, including questionable decision-making, poor leadership and political interference, as the newspaper claims. Joining us for insight into the alleged malaise is social justice organisation Open Secrets investigator Raisa Patho. Raisa, very good morning. Good to speak to you. Is it all about political interference? Is it about incompetence? What are the challenges that you see at the NPA?
Thank you so much, Hugo. And this is a great question because often we have to consider whether we're talking about interference or corruption or incompetence. I think the NPA is struggling at the moment to find its feet after years of political interference, particularly under the Zuma era. And I don't think it's fair to say that the NPA is not doing anything. I think that they are working very hard behind the scenes to work on state capture cases. But at the moment, things are just moving too slow, and they don't have enough competent prosecutors who can deal with complex financial crimes that is required when looking at state capture crimes.
But who's to blame for the lack of competent prosecutors? Surely Sheila Batoy and her team should be employing competent people.
Yes, and I know that the Batoy leadership has itself admitted that they don't have prosecutors who can deal with these cases. Unfortunately, the current leadership has known this since 2018 when they first became involved in the NPA. And it's confusing to understand how come we don't yet have competent prosecutors working in the NPA. How come there aren't enough prosecutors who have the skills to deal with financial crimes the way that we need to in order to address state capture and corruption, especially now that the Zondo report is nearing its end and we're going to be looking for accountability for these actors who have been found to be complicit in state capture.
Well, it's interesting that you say we shouldn't shoulder blame on the NPA, but in the same vein, you've said it's been 4 years since they've been in office and they have not made a plan. So who is to blame if not the NPA themselves?
Yes, I mean, what I mentioned was that I don't think the NPA is doing nothing. I think that they are trying. It's just that it seems that they haven't made the decisions to bring us forward, and they need to answer for that. They need to be transparent with South Africans about why they are struggling to find competent prosecutors, why they are struggling to make decisions on state capture cases. And unfortunately, until they are transparent, they will not regain public trust the way that they have promised they would do so in the post-Zuma era. This is unfortunate to see, and we hope that in due course they will become more transparent about what they are doing to address state capture cases.
Well, let's talk about what you mentioned earlier when you talked about struggling to find their feet. In the ideal world, where would the NPA be at the moment? If, for instance, is there an invisible hand, if you will, that is meddling and contributing to this lack of progress?
Yes, I think by now we should have seen a few state capture prosecutions go forward. Let's be clear that not all state capture crimes are crimes that involve racketeering charges, for example. Some of them are charges that involve fraud and other issues that are much easier to prosecute than, for example, a big racketeering case. And the NPA hasn't explained how come it hasn't been able to bring these prosecutions forward. Let's also remember that we did not need a Zondo commission to know that there were certain actors involved in state capture. These cases could have been brought forward much earlier, and the NPA should answer as to why it hasn't brought these cases forward. It hasn't given a definitive answer to say what processes it is following to bring state capture cases to court and what the delays have been in bringing these cases forward.
Now, there's been an investigation that you've been involved in, I believe, called the demise of the NPA. Now, as an investigator, can you unpack for us some of the things that you found, some of those things that are glaring?
Yeah, so what we found is that the NPA has always been vulnerable to political interference. And in the Zuma era, particularly under Jibba and Sean Abrams' leadership as National Directors of Public Prosecutions, this erosion of the NPA, this political interference in the NPA simply got to a groundswell where it became very pervasive and it interfered in prosecutorial decision-making. As a result of this, there were also prosecutors who were involved in carrying out the decisions which Abrams and Jibba made. And these prosecutors, as far as we understand, have yet to be properly investigated and held to account for their actions. The NPA has not released any statements or public sort of acknowledgement of what is happening behind the scenes to show that prosecutors are being held to account. Jipa was also made to face perjury and fraud charges as a result of her conduct, and the NPA has yet to make a decision on this. So ultimately what we find is that in the Zuma era, the NPA was facing dense political interference that interfered with its processes, and in the post-Zuma era, it's failing to hold account the prosecutors who were involved in corrupting the agency or in leading the agency down a downward spiral.
Now, one of the things that is mentioned is that there have been 6 national directors of prosecuting, and of these, none have completed their 10-year term. Is it a case of the wrong individual having been appointed in the first instance, which is a number of 6 times, or is it a situation of them making the wrong decisions or not towing the line, so to speak, according to the powers that be?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a mixture of both. There were definitely certain NDPPs who were appointed who were not found to be fit for office. You'll remember that Menzi Similane was one of these NDPPs. And then, of course, there were NDPPs who faced smear campaigns, who faced interference in their decision-making. And at the end of the day, some of them, like, for example, the former NDPP, Busi Pikoli, simply accepted a settlement and left office, and it was the same with Bulelani Ngcuka. He also simply said, look, I resign. And I think the difficulty of political interference, of smear campaigns, of meddling within the NPA has made it increasingly hard to find an NDPP who can fulfill that 10-year term. But ultimately, it is a need for us to appoint people into that office who can hold the ground at the NPA and who can resist these measures and say that I'm staying. That is what we need. We need stability in the NPA's leadership in order to see public trust increase and in order to see movements made on prosecutions that are important to disrupt corruption.
Now, as an investigator, I'm sure that you've established where the source of contention is, and as far as political interference is concerned. Care to speak to us about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's well known that in the Zuma era, there were certain positions that were taken that seemingly looked to defend Zuma's position to keep him out of legal trouble. We can see this in the way that, for example, corruption allegations in the arms deal case was dropped against him by some of the NDPs. And yeah, it was primarily interference in the Zuma era that led to the erosion of the NPA. Ultimately, however, nowadays, when we look at the current conditions of the NPA, we can say that Zuma is no longer there, you know. We have a new leadership, and this leadership should be taking action to bring the NPA back into the repute so that it can rebuild public trust and carry out its duties as it is meant to.
Are you suggesting that the NPA has not been given, or their mandate still needs to be endorsed, even though they're in office? Because
Sorry, could you just...
You seem to suggest that, I mean, the allegation is that the NPA is perceived to be toothless, right? They have a mandate, and that mandate is of that of public prosecution. However, there are suggestions, or if I'm reading between the lines, that they seem not to have endorsement from the powers that be to carry out their mandate, even though it is evidently there.
No, I mean, I don't think that's a fair allegation to make. I think that the NPA knows what its mandate is. And I think that at the moment we can't say that there are political actors that are interfering at the NPA. There's simply no evidence of that. All we can say is that the NPA has simply lacked decisiveness in dealing with state capture cases. And for some reason, things are moving exceptionally slow. This could be down to, as we discussed earlier, incompetence, or it could be down to interference. From our side, we can't say that there's interference. We can only say that there aren't enough competent prosecutors to take on these cases, which is part of where the crisis lies at the moment.
Now, let's try and marry the relationship, certainly between the National Prosecuting Authority and the police. We have a new police commissioner that's just come into effect. How do these two roles complement each other, and how do you see it moving forward, certainly in the fighting of high-profile crimes?
Yeah, it's an absolutely important point to make. The Hawks in particular play an important role in the NPA's investigations, particularly as it pertains to state capture. Unfortunately, what we've seen is that, occasionally the NPA will say, the Hawks haven't completed their investigations, and yet so we are unable to make a prosecutorial decision. And in the case of the Hawks, they might say that, we're ready to move forward. The investigations are near completion. So there seems to be a miscommunication that's happening. And like I said, I think that it would be greater served if there were more transparency in this area. The police commissioner now will have to make sure that the police can rebuild after years of interference there as well. Police corruption in the police forces has meant that a number of senior policemen have left. There have been people moved to positions where they should not be. And there will be a lot of work done to rehabilitate the police, and particularly the Hawks, which is arguably in a worse position than the NPA itself, in terms of grappling to deal with the sort of outcome of state capture and the impact that has had on its abilities. So the NPA and the Hawks in particular work very closely, and both agencies will need to internally rehabilitate themselves in order to efficiently take on state capture crimes.
Raisa Patha, investigator at Open Secrets, we thank you for your time this morning.